Thank you. Good morning. Very much appreciate you coming today. Just for the benefit of the tape and for those watching on the internet and on Parliament TV, please could you just give your names and positions?
Good morning. Drew Povey, Head Teacher at Harrowfold School.
Val Gillies, Professor of Social Policy and Criminology at University of Westminster.
Kevin Gill, Chief Executive of the Nurture Group Network.
Thelma.
Morning. If you had a school that had the correct provision, the right ethos, a broad and balanced curriculum, trained staff, a trained mental wellbeing designated person, and enough funding, would it be possible to not need alternative provision? So, in-house, in-school provision. Is there a possible scenario with the right ethos in a school that there would be no need for alternative provision? I just want your thoughts on that.
If people are happy for me to start, I think it is possible to do that. Harrowfold as a school is an extraordinary place, born from an extraordinary history. Because of the difficulties that we've been through, we've had to learn to do things differently, whether that's leadership or dealing with our finances. We've also had to look at the way we structure our behaviour management at the school. And around 10 years ago, we had an open conversation with staff at the school with regards to the point of education, which was very important to us about what education's for. And it was a conversation around, is it preparing young people for work? But we stripped it further back than that and said it's actually preparing young people for life. And as a result of that, we shifted our mindset to move from we can't exclude young people to we don't exclude. And that was extremely powerful for us as a school. And we're very proud to say that we've not excluded a student fixed term or permanently now for over 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible, but I think it's very, very difficult in the current system. I think schools can be quite difficult, hostile places for many struggling children.
Just coming in on that, when you say hostile places, could I have your thoughts on, specifically, nurture groups? Having been a former head, I've had experience of that and the outcomes. I just would be interested to know.
Well, I mean, I've done research on in-school exclusion units, not including nurture groups. I mean, personally, I would think I can see the value to having groups with a kind of very defined remit for Year 7 to help with transition. But I think, often it goes a bit beyond that, and that can be a bit problematic.
Obviously I think that if we can keep children in school, then, as we've heard previously, it's the best place for them to learn. So if we can provide an alternative provision within the school setting, then that's an ideal scenario. It doesn't necessarily have to be an alternative provision. If the school has the right kind of nurturing ethos all the way through, there is a way of de-escalating a lot of the problems that end up with children being excluded at an earlier stage. And with the right training for teachers and teaching staff and the right support, then that can be achieved and is achieved in many schools. And Drew's School is an example of that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a nurture group within the school to achieve that if the school has the right kind of approach right from the word go.
And the learning support units and behaviour support units?
Well, I mean, I think, schools should be inclusive, welcoming places, but very often they're just not. Sometimes I think there's a reason for taking young people out of that kind of very pressurised environment, and that can be a good thing, but it comes with risks if you take young people out. I mean, maybe I should tell you a bit about the kinds of units that I was researching in, because they are, the best way to look at them, I think, is to see them as alternative provision, but run by and within the schools themselves. Very often they are run, slightly separate from the main school building. So often they're in a separate block or in a porter cabin. Often they run their own separate timetables, so they have different breaks, different lunch times from the mainstream school. Sometimes there's even a fenced-off playground to kind of prevent mixing inside the units, they spend a lot of time doing building social and emotional skills, things like circle time, anger management, that kind of thing. They have, in some units, teachers come in to the units to deliver kind of core lessons in English and maths. In other units, young people are set work, so there aren't qualified teachers in the units at all, and they just have to get on with the work they're given. And in some other instances, young people attend the units on a kind of part-time basis on 1 or 2 days a week.
So in terms of their reintegration, following this, how is that?
Where there's that segregated model, of course, they're kind of they're not keeping up with what's going on in the classroom. The education, the provision in terms of education can sometimes be very poor. If they're in a unit where there aren't any trained teachers, even where the teachers are coming into the unit, that's usually given to supply teachers. It doesn't tend to be a very popular job. Teachers don't want to go in to the unit and teach them. So they don't have an opportunity to build a relationship with the teachers in the first place. So the longer they are in those units for, the harder it is then to reintegrate back into mainstream. The other issue as well is that they kind of end up then carrying a certain level of stigma because the teachers know where they've been, they have a reputation. The teachers then end up seeing them as potential trouble. They watch them more closely, they call them out, they're more likely to call them out over things, which then can make the young person feel quite resentful and persecuted, and then, you know,
I think that's reinforcing the original point about getting the ethos right,
yes,
and that shared purpose of what education's about.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Emma.
I've got a quick question. It's particularly for Drew. One of the things I'm really keen to do is to celebrate the schools that are inclusive. And when we had Amanda Spielman in, we talked about whether Ofsted could do some kind of recognition for schools that are inclusive and to try and go against the incentive that it seems at the moment to get rid of children.
Yes.
And I wondered who might affect their grades, and I wondered what you thought about having that recognition and how it could work.
I think it's good. I mean, people have already said that we like a badge in education and we like a badge in life, don't we? And I think there is an opportunity to do that. Would be good to reward schools, because it takes a big call from governors to say we're not going to exclude, and a big call from staff to say we will take a hit on our results. In a performance-driven world, that is going to be a reality. But you've got to, again, strip it back to what I was saying before. We got into this job to give young people the absolute best. And by putting them into the wrong type of provision is not going to do that. Therefore, we shouldn't be doing it. And it's about putting the argument together and having that conversation with Ofsted to say, look, this is what we believe in. We've created this environment. It's the best thing for these young people. Therefore, this is what our data looks like. But it's difficult because it won't be represented in things like league tables. It won't be. So therefore, the school could be seen in a certain light. But we've got fantastic support from our local community as well that really gets what we're doing. And that's about the way that we communicate what Harrop Fold's about. And one of the reasons we did the TV series was to celebrate the things that happen in the school, because we are different for all the right reasons, I think. And we're very proud of what we've been able to produce, and having a school centred on the needs of all young people, regardless of the background, has been key for us.
Have you been able to assess the impact of the fact that you haven't excluded children and the better behavioural outcomes and better outcomes for those children who would have been excluded who haven't been?
It's probably hard to assess because they don't go into alternative provision. But what I would say is, if you take one of the students in the series, Cody,
progression.
Yes, her progress was phenomenal, and she did have her challenges at school, and I'm absolutely certain that in many other settings she would have been permanently excluded. But we believe that she could turn a corner. We've got tiers of provision within the school that is slightly different, I think, from what you might see elsewhere. And it's perfect for our young people. We got Cody through to the end. She didn't break any records when it came to exam results, but she did really well, and she went on to college, and she'll be coming back to Harrop to train as an apprentice, as a teaching assistant soon.
How many children in other schools would have been excluded roughly a year that you have not excluded?
Again, it's hard to say because we've not been excluding for a long time, but when we rewind back when the school was having particularly difficulties 10, 12 years ago, it would have been about 486 exclusions a year in our school.
And of all those, would you say the vast majority have progressed in some way?
Say again, sorry.
All those children you haven't excluded who have difficulties?
Yes.
Would you say that the vast majority of them have been able to progress significantly by not being excluded?
Hugely so, not always academically,
but
in terms of, we do a lot of case studies with our student development team that is a non-teaching pastoral structure, which has been key for us to be able to monitor where the school, where we have impact as a school. And through a number of case studies, we can show huge progress and life progress for these young people, which might not always show up on academic.
And do you check their outcomes when they leave the school?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
For how long?
Yeah, as long as we can. We have somebody who's in charge of student futures at the school, and that's monitored into the future. And because the school did have a difficult time around 10, 12 years ago, there's a group of young people...
And what do the outcomes show?
For
you said you checked the outcomes.
Yes.
What on the whole? Obviously, you could send us more information if that was
absolutely
better. But in general terms, what do they show?
It's whether they're in a college placement or work, and that they've actually been able to go out and have an impact, a positive impact in the local community. And again, we've still got a group of young people that we feel we've got to go back to that are aged between 25 and 30, and we've got aspirations to do some kind of provision locally that can re-engage them with education and probably do the job that we should have done over 10 years ago. So we do track them right the way into the futures because we know the families because they live in the area.
And if I could just ask you, if it's okay to call you by your first names, Val, why aren't more schools doing this? If this school has shown that it can be done properly, and could they?
Could they do it in
the same way? And why are more not doing so?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think schools are very, very pressurised places. I think schools have been really squeezed. Teachers are squeezed. Young people and children are squeezed in terms of the pressures on them, and you end up kind of pushing some children out. Schools have the wider agenda of the best interests of the school, and it's not always in the best interests of particular marginalised young people. So I think their interests are set apart. Sometimes it's better for the school to have a young person put into a unit so they're not kind of sucking up all the resources in the classroom. They can concentrate on young people who are finding it easier to achieve. I think there's other functions of those units as well, in that they operate sometimes as a kind of a way to threaten young people, to say you will end up in there if you don't behave.
And not all young people, I think I need to be very clear on this, will make it through the time at Harrop Fold. I mean, we'll give all young people a go, and that includes people that might have been excluded from other settings. But it's about finding the right provision for young people as well. And rather than exclude the students, we will look at, for example, we had a young person last year that we managed to get into therapeutic care because they could do a better job than we could have done with the resources and the skill sets that we've got in school. Another young man went on to the School of Military because that was the right setting. But for us at Harrop, we believe that the label of the permanent exclusion can impact negatively on an already very difficult situation.
And does the new Progress Attainment measures give an incentive potentially for more exclusion because of the weighting if a child fails?
Yes, absolutely it does. If you have a student that's not going to reach levels of progress for a myriad of different reasons, you will see significant impact on the school's overall results.
So what's the solution to that? Changing the weighting or making sure that the school has to track the student all the way through, so he's accountable for you could have a system, for example, where the student was accountable for the student even if he'd been excluded.
Yes.
And it could either be fully accountable or partially accountable in terms of the grading and so on. Is that a solution or not?
I think it could work. I think there could be, I mean, people talk about the outliers now, both positively and negatively, but I think we could do more with that work to say, you know, you're allowed a certain percentage. Actually, it would be useful to look at case by case to say which students actually have the school done a really good job with in terms of social progress as well as academic progress. And I think that would definitely shift the balance. But it's very, very difficult for school leaders, you know, to be in a position where when you've got to make a difficult call and the impact and the stakes are so high, you know, it's a very difficult environment for school leaders to make those kind of decisions.
Okay. One from...
I have to go to another meetings, but I'm fascinated by the contribution, and I absolutely agree it has to start with an approach that says this is our goal, as opposed to let's just minimise exclusions actually, and everything flows from that, and it's quite evident that that approach is working in your case. Practical reasons or practical answers to how in-school alternatives work alongside alternative provision. Previous session, I'm interested in my constituency adopting in-school provision and bringing young people back out of that are being educated out of borough back into borough. What are some of those practical ideas to the whole panel?
In terms of understanding the reasons why children are excluded and exhibit the behaviour they do, when we actually understand that and when we can measure that, we actually really, teachers have a better idea of how they can work with their children. And we can de-escalate these situations. If we understand the social emotional pressures that children are under, where they are in their life cycles, and the earlier we start, the better. Teachers can do a lot more in schools, and it doesn't take a massive shift of emphasis. Most teachers want to do the best for pupils, and most head teachers want the best for their schools and their pupils. And what we need to do is to be able to measure that social emotional development as well as the academic element as well. And we can do that. That's readily available. And we do that and change the emphasis and the way schools look at pupils from an early stage. We can prevent a lot of these issues, particularly when they get to the secondary school stage. If we work in nursery and primary much earlier, we can short circuit a lot of this.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think unless there is a very clearly defined objective for having internal units, there is a real danger that they end up as a kind of dumping ground for difficult.
So can you say that again? Because
I said unless there is a very clearly defined objective for these units, they can end up as a dumping ground for difficult, challenging young people, and certainly that's what I saw in my research. I mean, in some schools, I mean, I was in 3 schools. I looked at 3 schools in particular. All 3 of them had policies around how long these young people should actually be in the units for. It was between 4 and 6 weeks. But in reality, young people stayed in there for far longer. In one school, they were there for years. And in fact, young people would come in from primary school and never touch the mainstream. They would go straight into the units. These were very often young people with SEN needs, possibly undiagnosed SEN, or coping with all kinds of particular
And Drew,
challenges.
you don't have these units, internal units, do you?
Yeah, we have different tiers of intervention. So we do actually, we've got 3. So we've got an area we call the Reflect area, which is around self-referral. Students with mental health issues or maybe medical issues would self-refer to that area of school. We've got the Refocus room that is more about behaviour concerns directed from teachers, and that's about relationships and restorative justice. But then we also have the Refresh unit, which is around students can come there if they have been accessing something externally or they have gone to another school for a respite placement, they come back in. It's about that level of reintegration, which I think that's the key point you were making there. We've got to reintegrate them into school life correctly, because if you're going to have a caring environment and a student's being in a certain setting, just bringing them in and putting them in the general population is not going to work, and it's certainly not the best thing for the young people. And I think having those areas, and also training the staff and significant understanding of staff that this is what the school's about, with that mindset that you mentioned there, has given us the ability to flex our systems to do the very best thing for young people. And young people will bring new challenges, and we'll have to flex our systems again, and that's the reality that we face. I don't think we'll be able to keep going just like this much longer. We'll be looking for new ways of doing things into the future as well. But I think that's all based on that premise we're coming from, which is we don't exclude at Harrow.
That's true. Thelma.
It's all about choice and
Yes.
flexibility, isn't it? It's
Absolutely.
what we're going back, and the child being, or young person being at the centre
Yes.
of that.
And you never quite know what a young person's going to present
No.
and where they're coming from. And
No, but they have a voice in it.
Absolutely.
This is what we said earlier, and that idea of the thematic approach to the curriculum as well.
Yes.
And, you know, it's all part and part. There isn't one thing.
No, there isn't. There's never a one-size-fits-all, and therefore your behaviour management structure shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. This should be situational and bespoke to the needs of the young person.
Absolutely.
And, you know, some people have looked at our Reflect setup, which is a student counsellor, and, you know, we do have financial constraints, particularly at Harrow with our deficit, and our link area. And some people might say superficially, well, the kids can just take themselves there and just get out of lessons, but you get very, you know, fast at understanding and quick at, and better at understanding if a young person does that. It's about finding the right support for that young person and understanding why they need that level of support is a crucial question. Absolutely.
Ian.
Yeah. I mean, undoubtedly true, you're doing a good job, but I think generally what's, you know, from our perspective, you know, it's good to know that there's good practice happening in one school, but we need it to be generalised across the piece. And I'm looking for answers about, you know, the questions: are schools increasing or decreasing their use of in-school alternatives? And if they are, what are the reasons for that? And if they're not, you know, why do you think that is?
Well, in terms of the work that we do, we've found that there are more nurture groups in schools now than there ever have been. Mm-hmm. We train more specialist teachers now than we ever have done. Mm-hmm. We have a tool called the Boxall Profile, which assesses children's social emotional development. We've developed that as a web-based app 2 years ago, and now we have hundreds of schools and hundreds of users using that to assess. I think we assessed 29,000 children last year, and you use it. And through that, we can track a child's social emotional development as well. So there is more going on, but there needs to be more done. And we would like to see more schools taking a whole school approach to this kind of identification of children and working with children, and the kind of interventions that Drew uses as well, in terms of it doesn't have to be a separate unit within school to be an alternative provision in school. It can be a different kind of support to children. But a structured programme that we would recommend is all about inclusion, and it's all about reintegration. The whole way we train teachers is about working with the child's needs, and we would work for maybe 2 to 4 terms would be the process that we would be looking at. But the child stays part of their mainstream class at the same time, and works within the mainstream class on subjects where they are more comfortable perhaps and can perform a bit better. So there is a lot more going on, but it needs to be more structured, and I think it needs to have an impetus from perhaps from the department or from government to actually really say, well, this works, we've got the evidence that this works, why aren't we doing more of it? And that is kind of where we would like to see it move to.
Yeah, but Kevin, you've talked about hundreds of schools having an intervention, with your programme. But I mean, there are over 4,000 secondary schools, and increasingly now children manifesting behavioural difficulties in primary schools as well, which are difficult to deal with. So you know, that's hardly scratching the surface, really, from that perspective.
Yeah, we've got about 2,000 odd schools having nurture groups. So yeah, there's a lot more to be done. A lot more to be done.
Well,
Well, I think that's quite a difficult question to answer because there's no kind of central records kept of how many schools have these kinds of units. We don't know what kind of children are being sent to them. You know, there's no kind of there's no profile in terms of SEN or ethnicity or whether they're care leavers. We don't know why they've been sent there. And we don't know how long they're there for. So, you know, I think there's...
So there's no sort of across the piece mapping being done of exactly what's happening out there?
No.
Drew?
And I think it's important to say what gets measured gets done. And because the exam system is so heavily measured, I think that is where you'll see most of the focus put on, which is a shame because this piece of work, and it's great that we're having this conversation today, is so important because there are so many young people affected by it. I also think there's so much good practice. I realise the figures are staggering and worrying, but I also know that there's a lot of schools doing some fantastic work and they're not being asked about what they're being done, and I understand, you know, that negativity bias, and we'll concentrate on those things, but I do think we could shine a light on some of the good work that's happening across all schools, particularly in this area.
I mean, but overall, is the quality of provision in schools improving, or is it deteriorating? I mean, are too many schools taking the easy alternative?
I mean, in terms of exclusions, the data would suggest so, but again, I think if you go back to that concept of what does get measured gets done, and if we're so monomaniacal on performance in terms of exam performance, certain elements of a rounded education are going to be lost, and that's without doubt something that is happening within this area of alternative provision. And I think people have made some really good points that alternative provision is not just a unit tucked away or a room that certain young people have to go to. It is part of the general population of the school, and a young person might go to study history with their peers, but go into a different classroom, even studying a different exam board for history. That would be alternative provision, and we need to normalise it as much as possible so that everybody feels that they're part and parcel of that system.
I mean, you know, alternative provisions existed in schools for donkey's years. I mean, you know, Billy Bunter was in the remove, wasn't he? You know, most of the time. So, what additional support do schools need to provide good quality in school alternatives? So this is the $64,000 question. Right?
Well, I've got a list. I mean, the issue about SEN, obviously, it's so important. I mean, I think young people end up in the internal units possibly for three main reasons. One, SEN, which shouldn't be the case. Or they've perhaps they have undiagnosed SEN, or they've been struggling and they've fallen behind, or there are other issues going on in their lives that aren't, you know, I think, you know, they don't, sometimes they need a break in terms of school, you know, in terms of rather than the intensive, relentless focus on academic performance. So I think someone mentioned mentors. They are a great resource. And yeah, they're the first to go in terms of education cuts at the moment, but because teachers are so pressured, they often don't have an opportunity to get to know young people or understand the various different challenges that they might be dealing with. So mentors can operate as a really important bridge. I think greater value placed on teachers who have experience of working with more challenging pupils who are often very skilled, but that's not recognised. A massive resource, I think, would be to provide parents with some kind of advocacy support, because often they fight tooth and nail for their kids, but the power imbalance is just too much. Everything's stacked in favour of the school.
If a school does have a support unit in the school, when Ofsted goes to inspect, what happens? Do they look at that separately, or do they look at just measure the whole school?
They measure the whole school. The other issue is around the different understandings of inclusion, because inclusion used to, and can be attached to a social justice agenda. It means about an institution being more inclusive and welcoming to all pupils. But what it's increasingly come to mean is taking young people and working on them to try and make them more includable. So they're kind of excluded to be included. That's happening a lot, but often it still carries the gloss of the first understanding of inclusion.
And if a school does have a unit within the school, like you were talking earlier about some students kept there for a couple of weeks, some for years on end, should there be be taken into consideration? There should be some special measurement by Ofsted in terms of whether those units are doing their work properly and actually succeeding for the pupils.
Well, I think certainly at least some measure of how many there are and what their we have no idea what their progress is. I mean, I have an inkling, but there are no records kept anywhere, so that would be I think that would be quite important. The other issue I really wanted to mention, though, was the impact of poverty, because I just don't think we recognise really at the moment the really quite enormous impact that poverty and poor housing and other kinds of disadvantages can have on young people's ability to learn and to engage in the classroom. The young people that I was working with were coping with all kinds of a whole array of challenges that I think would floor many adults. If you're coming into school and you're hungry, if you don't know where you're going to be living from one day to the next, if you're caring perhaps for very sick parents, if you're being threatened by a violent local gang in the area, all of these issues, it's not going to help to be taken away necessarily into a separate unit to work on your social and emotional skills.
And do the others, because of time, want to comment briefly on answer the question that I just posed about how these units should be possibly inspected or measured in terms of whether they're actually achieving what they're supposed to do?
Well, everything should be measured to some extent when it's involving a child's education. Within Nurture, we use the Boxall profile to gauge progress amongst its developmental abilities, social emotional development, as well as behavioural development as well. And that's quite easy and easy to monitor and measure progress. And Ofsted do recognise that that's a really good measure of how to understand child progress. And also that's something that's actually really easy to install in schools. It's really easy to use. It takes a little bit of skill to actually really interpret the results, but it's actually a very easy thing to bring into schools as a way of measuring those kind of interventions.
Thank you. Concisely.
Yes, I think there are some really good pieces of work going on at the moment. I think Kieran Gill, I know, was here the other week, and she's running the Difference programme, and that's a really good way of upskilling specialism both in mainstream and in different settings. I think sharing of best practice would be crucial. I do think funding should be put more in terms of pastoral staff. The amount of times people have come into our school and said to us, you could deal with some of the finance issues that is a legacy debt that you've been left with by getting rid of your pastoral structure, and we've said that would be the most stupid thing we could possibly do. And what I would say is it is possible to create an inclusive environment, because once it's not just about students that might be looking at alternative provision for behaviour or for the whole myriad of needs should be catered for. We've got students with visual impairment, hearing impairment, physical disabilities. It's about welcoming all young people into that community. And once the staff have that mindset, the students have that mindset, and there's a collective responsibility for everybody to look after each other. And I know I've invited the committee up to Harrottfold. It's it's a brilliant place that is doing some quite inspirational things, and that's not me as head teacher. That's the brilliant students that come and the fantastic staff that work there too.
If I could just take a very brief answer to a question. In terms of in-house, looking at in-house provision for students with mental health difficulties, is your view that it's appropriate or not appropriate? I mean, are there groups of pupils for whom in-house alternative provision just isn't right? If you could.
From our perspective, we're doing everything we can at the moment, but we are seeing that group of students grow in number. We do have a link group and we do have a trained counsellor on site, but we probably need to look to expanding that to 2 counsellors. And we do have conversations with the local authority about we kind of up our threshold within the local authority, so we manage a lot more in school than possibly others might, but it's certainly an area of growth.
Okay. Just briefly, if you can.
Certainly, you can, and you can de-escalate a lot of the issues, but will always be pupils with mental health needs that cannot be addressed in school and need specialist provision. There are some fabulous therapeutic schools. Drew mentioned one earlier on, that do the kind of work that actually is just beyond school staff, and that's just a fact of life, that those kind of mental issues are so severe that they do need that absolute specialist provision. But a lot can be dealt with within the school setting with the right support and training.
Before, unless you had do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'll just say that I think that, obviously, there are some mental health needs that need to be dealt with outside of the school, but I think we do need to recognise as well that schools have an enormous impact on young people's mental health in the first place.
Before I pass on to Trudy for final question, could I just ask you would have heard the previous session when I raised this issue about making sure there is some kind of Bill of Rights for pupils and parents, not that you should take away autonomy from head teachers, but just so that there is some kind of level playing field and a genuine right of appeal that has to be listened to. Could we have your concise views on that, if we could?
I think it's a good idea, but I think I'm not sure whether that will give a better level of understanding. And from my perspective, I think we need a better level of understanding from parents, head teachers, local communities, and the understanding of the league tables too.
And at the moment, there's no understanding at all.
Yes.
So at least that would be one step towards it, if you see it, an incremental step, perhaps. But
yeah, potentially.
If you explain, yeah.
Oh, I think it'd be very important. I think the relationship between parents and teachers in schools sometimes can be very, very poor and can, become quite sort of corrosive and break down entirely. So I think, that would help prevent that. And advocacy support as well.
Yeah, I think that could provide a framework for a better understanding between the school and its community, its wider community, parents, pupils alike. And anything that gives that kind of framework structure that parents really understand the process a bit more clearly, that would be a benefit.
Okay, we can take a final question from Trudy.
Yeah, moving off the subject slightly, we've talked a lot about the human factor. I'm just interested to know, to what extent does the physical design of schools impact on its ability to provide alternative provision? And I'm looking at you in particular, Drew, because you've talked about different rooms and units, and I wondered, how important the architecture was in being able to do that.
It is. I mean, I think you work with what you've got in a school. We were fortunate. We went in 2008 to a very traditional build, which works for us. I do know head teacher colleagues that have had an absolute nightmare with open plan areas because they felt that wasn't right for the type of provision that they wanted to put in. What I would say is for us, we're very happy with our building. We'd like it to be a bit bigger. I think every head teacher would say that, but no, we're happy with it. But it does mean that we can have areas where young people can go and feel safe, and I think that's the difficulty sometimes with open plan.
And as we move forward, do we feel that the architects involved with DFE, building new schools, are taking that into account?
I'd like to think they would look at the British system and the schools we've got in Britain, as opposed to going abroad to a completely different part of the world with a completely different mindset and then trying to mirror what they've done, which I think is where we've probably fallen foul of this in the past.
Certainly with nurture group provision, we like the nurture groups to be an integral part of the school and as much into the centre of the school as possible, so they're not seen as a different part of the school. It's really important that these pupils feel as though they still remain part of the school community as a whole, and they're not being singled out to be shunted off to maybe a porta cabin at the end of the playing field. And that's a real major element of inclusion, is making sure that people stay part of everything that's going on in the school community.
And all our the reflect, the refocus and the refresh rooms are all right in the centre of our school.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you're in a block separate from the mainstream school, you're out of sight and out of mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very important question to end with. Thank you. Could I thank you? We've got nothing but admiration for the work you do, and our predecessor panel that came this morning as well, and you're all highly respected, and we hope very much that our report, in fact it definitely will, reflect much of the evidence that you have, all of you have given today, and we wish you every success.
Can I also, I mean, you've obviously been constrained by time. If there's anything that you think we should have asked and didn't, and you would like us to have the answer to it in evidence, please send it forward. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
We finished that Drew pointed out 3 areas: funding, sharing best practice and engaging with the research. Those are the 3 things I'm taking away with me, and I think we should.
But we wish you every possible success in your work. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding